Hi, my name is Mike Dwyer, and I'm from the Beara Peninsula in West Cork. I live here in Boston for the last 50 years, and my story has to do with copper mining. We had copper mines back in the Beara Peninsula in prehistoric times. They were actually on the farm where Padraig Harrington's, the golfer's father, was born and raised. But since then, more recently, there were copper mines in the Allihies parish, which is the extreme end of the Beara Peninsula. And they were developed by the Puxley family, who came down from Galway to manage property that the heirs inherited from the Cromwell time of Cromwell. I guess this was how Cromwell paid his men. He gave them land. And so the Puxleys made a lot of money in the Allihies mines. The wages were poor, conditions were atrocious, and they lasted from around 1812 to 1882. Then many of the miners from Beara immigrated to Butte, Montana, because it just worked out that they had discovered the rich copper veins in Butte, Montana, discovered by a man from County Canton by the name of Marcus Daly. And Marcus Daly wanted Irish workers. He had the benefit of having people from the Beara Peninsula who were experienced in hard rock mining. The mines in Allihies went down under the ocean, 1,500 feet. But when he discovered the copper in Montana, the Irish flocked there, and they developed the city of Montana. It was unlike other cities in the East Coast, where they were up against an existing culture. In Butte, the Irish established their own city. It was their town. They developed it, they ran it, and they thrived there as well as any group could thrive in those years. This was around 1876, I think it began, and they're actually still mining there right now. Open field, open trench, open mining. They just blast away at the rock, and it's all above board open. But in those days, it was a matter of digging down into the rock and digging horizontally, following the copper vein. And it was extremely dangerous work. There were several copper mines around the world at the time, and many in Russia, but the mines in Butte, Montana were the most dangerous mines. Many people died. There was one horrendous accident there in 1917 where 168 miners lost their lives in a fire. And there's a memorial to those miners high up overlooking the city of Butte today. So my grandfather and his brothers and 3 of their sisters all lived in Butte, Montana 100 years ago. My grandfather was the last to leave. His older brother, Mike Dwyer, went off out there in the 1890s, came through New Bedford, worked there to get the price of his ticket out to Montana, which was $25 from New York, and arrived there and brought his sisters and his brothers to Butte. He then went off and took that unbelievable journey up to the Klondike and worked there for a while, sold his claims, and came back and bought a pub, a saloon in the Mullen House in Butte, which is also run by Beara women. He sent money back home to my father, to my grandfather, and his father, and they built a house with that money beside the new road which ran by our land. And my brother put up a sign there about 10 years ago when he discovered where the money came from, and he calls it the Klondike House. So it's known by that name right now. My grandfather went out there around 1910, left his wife and children back in Beara in the care of his father. His father lived to be 90, and I guess he took care of them all those years while his son was missing in Montana. I asked my father one time if he remembered his father, knowing that he'd been absent. He said, I remember a man coming to the house one time. That was all he knew. But there was a beautiful clock in our house that came from Butte, Montana. It struck the hour and the half hour, and my dad wound it every Saturday night faithfully, and it's still there on a mantle which is specially made for that clock. My grandfather then went back to Butte and continued mining. The mines in Butte at the turn of the century were a mile deep. There were 70 mines operating. There was 10,000 miners working on the ground, and Butte was booming. But unfortunately, like many of the other miners, his health failed. Silicosis of the lungs, or the miner's con as they called it, was the condition those people suffered from working in atrocious conditions where there was no fresh air. And they drilled holes into the face of the rock and blasted it, and then the muckers went in when the blast went off, and they shoveled that stuff into carts, which was hauled out by mules, raised to the surface, and then transported some 26 miles west to where Marcus Daly had his smelter. Another interesting connection there was another copper king, as they called him, William Clark. And Clark and Daly were enemies, basically. When Daly went to develop his smelter, he needed water. And he discovered the water rights were owned by Clark, and he paid dearly for the water rights. And that was the beginning of a feud. Montana at the time did not have a state capital, and Clark wanted Helena, and Daly wanted the town west of Butte, Anaconda. He had built that town around the smelter. So there was a lot of friction, a lot of paying, a lot of money changed hands, but eventually Clark got his way and had the capital in Helena. The curious thing about it is Daly supporters then erected directly in front of the main entrance an enormous equestrian statue to Maher of the sword, and it's a huge monument with a base, gigantic granite base, and all of Maher's quotes are etched into it. So it's Clark's. It was Daly's way of getting back and to Clark. In 1918, my grandfather moved to Phoenix, Arizona, because of his health was failing. He was advised that the dry air down there would be beneficial for him, and the company also had mines down there. Excuse me. But he did not live. It was too late. He died in November 22nd, 1918, and is buried in the beautifully landscaped cemetery in Butte. And to commemorate that anniversary, my nephew Finbar Dwyer, who lives back in that same house in Beara, and I went out to Phoenix this past November and visited his grave on the anniversary of his death. So that's basically the history of my family in the States. There are descendants of those families, cousins of mine that I'm discovering, and I have a cousin who lives in Southern California who is interested in the genealogy, and his daughter is into it, and they're discovering where all those people migrated to. And it's becoming very, very interesting. He actually has a book published on the Dwyers of Beara and their history in the United States. So I didn't hear any of this growing up from my dad. I don't know if he was unwilling to share, or if he suffered from the loss of his father, but it wasn't something he talked about. And so I discovered this out of my own curiosity, and that's my story.